What kind of leader gives away every acre of land? That was the question whispered for years in Burkina Faso. But now the answer has arrived. No auctions, no bargains, just one stroke of a pen, one law, and one promise. The soil returns to its people. In the early days of 2025, something happened in the heart of West Africa that most of the world could not imagine. Not in Paris, not in Washington, but in Ouagadougou. A nation decided that land could no longer be bought, sold, or hoarded. Burkina Faso, a country long dismissed as poor and landlocked, rewrote the very meaning of ownership. For centuries, Africa's soil had been treated as real estate, sold to foreign corporations, carved up for luxury projects, exploited for profit while its own people struggled. But this time, one man chose a different path. Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed a law that ended private land ownership altogether. Not a reform, a revolution. The question now is not whether this law was bold. The question is whether it can survive and what it means for Africa as a whole. Do not look away. What comes next may change how Africa writes its future. Subscribe, stay with us, and walk this journey to the end. In the first weeks of 2025, the government of Burkina Faso announced a law that would change the nation's destiny. With one act, every square meter of land, urban, and rural forest and farmland was transferred to state ownership. From that moment onwards, land would never again be bought or sold. The age of private land ownership was declared over. In its place, a new framework emerged: leaseholds. Citizens could access land for farming, building, or strategic projects, but only through temporary leases of 18 years or extended leases of 99 years when deemed nationally significant. The principle was clear: land could be used, but never owned. Foreigners, no matter their wealth, could no longer claim territory in Burkina Faso. Not French firms, not multinational corporations, not even the richest individual on earth. The soil was no longer an asset on a balance sheet. It was a national trust. This legal earthquake did not appear from nowhere. It deliberately replaced the notorious Expropriation Act of 1975, a colonial-era relic that had allowed governments to seize land under the pretext of public interest and then transfer it to foreign developers. For decades, that act had been the pipeline through which ancestral lands were lost. Golf resorts were built where elders once prayed, and monoculture plantations were established to feed European supermarkets while Burkinabe families went hungry. Now that pipeline was shut down permanently, the symbolism could not be ignored. In a continent where ownership had always been tied to power, Burkina Faso declared that ownership itself would vanish. Land was no longer a commodity. It was a right, a legacy, a bridge between the living and their ancestors. For ordinary citizens, it was a moment of astonishment. Many had never believed they would see the day when land could no longer be traded like cattle in a market. Yet the announcement was not accompanied by grand speeches or military parades. There were no tanks in the streets, no coups, no televised ceremonies. There was only a law signed in quiet but destined to echo loudly. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, often portrayed as a young soldier thrust into politics, had acted with the precision of a statesman. He did not ask permission, he did not wait for debate, he did not seek validation from external partners. He rewrote the rules of property with a single stroke of his pen. International observers rushed to call it reckless, even dangerous. But for the citizens of Burkina Faso, it was a rupture with centuries of dispossession. It was the first time their nation had proclaimed in law that the soil belonged not to investors, not to elites, but to the people as a collective. The distinction mattered. It was not framed as a gift from the government. It was not charity. It was recognition. Land had always been the backbone of survival, and for the first time, its control was embedded in law as sovereignty. Across villages and cities, the news spread quietly, but carried the weight of revolution. Farmers asked what this would mean for their fields. Women asked whether their cooperatives would finally receive secure plots. Youth wondered whether their future could now be built without fleeing abroad. And as the questions multiplied, one truth became unavoidable. The old system had collapsed overnight. Ownership was erased, and in its place stood a blank canvas. The law had been signed, but the story was only beginning. But if ownership itself is erased, who decides who tills the soil tomorrow? The law's announcement rippled through Burkina Faso like thunder after lightning. For farmers, it was a moment of hope almost too great to believe. Men and women who had worked the soil for decades without a title, who had rented plots from absentee landlords or begged for permission from elites, now heard the words they thought impossible. The land was no longer owned by others. It was theirs to use, theirs to cultivate, theirs to pass on through work, not through purchase. Women, long considered the backbone of agriculture yet systematically excluded from land ownership, felt a shift in the air. More than 60% of farming in Burkina Faso is done by women, yet most had never legally held a hectare in their name. Suddenly, the system that had ignored them was being overturned, and cooperative groups whispered of the possibilities fields secured for food production, livestock, processing, and local trade. Youth, too, looked on with cautious excitement. For decades, more than half of Burkina Faso's population under the age of 17 had been told that their numbers were a burden. Too many mouths, too few jobs. But under the new law, land was no longer a closed door. It was a launch pad. Young people envisioned farms run with technology, irrigation systems, and climate-smart practices, not just hoes and hand tools. Within the country, the sentiment was not loud celebration, but quiet disbelief turning slowly into trust. Across the world, however, the reaction was swift and hostile. Financial markets labeled the policy reckless, hostile to investment, a recipe for collapse. Think tanks in Europe and America issued reports warning of instability, sanctions, and isolation. Foreign embassies sent urgent cables whispering of aid suspensions and frozen partnerships. Investors began to withdraw from pending deals, canceling contracts, halting projects, and waiting to see whether this new policy would survive. Editorials in major newspapers framed Captain Ibrahim Traoré as a radical gambler, willing to sacrifice growth for ideology. But inside Africa, the story resonated differently. It was not recklessness. It was courage. Citizens of Mali, Niger, and Ghana began to ask why their governments could not trust their people in the same way. Youth movements and civil society organizations cited Burkina Faso in policy forums, chanting that sovereignty was not extremism but restoration. The contrast with South Africa was unavoidable. Just a year earlier, President Cyril Ramaphosa had reignited the debate on expropriation without compensation, reopening wounds left by apartheid land policies. The backlash had been immediate. Western leaders, including then U.S. President Donald Trump, condemned it as a land grab, warning of economic collapse. Investors threatened boycotts, and South Africa was forced into debates, committees, revisions, and pauses. The process dragged on, stuck in the machinery of compromise. Traoré watched, and then he chose a different path. He did not call for hearings. He did not form committees. He did not soften his words to reassure donors. He signed one law with no apologies, and in doing so, he closed the debate before it could begin. Commentators noted the speed. Where Pretoria had stumbled in endless process, Ouagadougou acted with purpose. Ramaphosa cracked the door open. Traoré kicked it off the hinges. For citizens weary of promises and delays, that distinction mattered. Courage was not in announcing a debate. Courage was in making a decision. Still, courage carries a cost. Burkina Faso found itself facing the same storm South Africa had, but with fewer resources and less global leverage. Sanctions loomed. Aid was suspended. Investment froze. The language had changed, but the empire remained the same. And yet, even as diplomats frowned and boardrooms panicked, ordinary people saw something different. A leader who was not asking permission. a leader who had drawn a line in the soil, a leader who believed sovereignty was not a slogan but a law. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was not merely policy, it was healing. It was a return to dignity. It was the soil saying no after centuries of being bought and sold. The louder the outside world protested, the deeper one question echoed within Africa. What comes next? But the louder the world shouted, the deeper one question echoed in Africa. What comes next? As the dust settled after the signing of the law, the true impact began to reveal itself not in headlines or diplomatic cables, but in the daily lives of ordinary Burkinabe. For the first time in living memory, farmers who had rented land year after year now stood on fields that no one could take from them. The fear of losing access with each harvest, the humiliation of working for absentee landlords, the quiet anger of watching foreign corporations fence off ancestral soil, all of it began to dissolve. Land was no longer a privilege for the wealthy. It was a guarantee for survival. Women who for generations had carried the burden of agriculture while being denied legal ownership found themselves at the center of reform. Cooperative groups, once relegated to the margins, were being granted direct access to secure plots. They began organizing, combining their plots into collective units, and planning not only for food production, but for processing, trade, and even export. The law did not treat them as secondary actors. It recognized them as strategists, the architects of local economies. And when women gained secure land rights, the effects rippled outward. Greater food security, higher school enrollment for children, and diversified income for households. For youth, the shift was even more profound. Over half of Burkina Faso's population under the age of 17 had been trapped in a narrative of despair, too many mouths to feed, too few jobs. But suddenly, land was framed not as a locked gate but as a launch pad. Government programs began linking land access to training in technology-driven agriculture, precision irrigation, vertical farming, agroecology, and climate-resilient seed varieties. Youth no longer had to abandon their villages in search of survival. They could stay, innovate, and build futures rooted in their own soil. It was not merely a redistribution of land, it was a redistribution of possibility. The law also struck at the core of corruption. For decades, a hidden pipeline had siphoned wealth away from the people. 10 tons of gold mined each day, yet only 1 ton officially reported. Millions of dollars lost to smuggling and backroom deals. Bribes worth $50 million paid to reduce tax rates from 30% to a mere 3%. That pipeline was closed. The government was no longer a broker arranging deals for outsiders. It was a guardian protecting national wealth. This reversal carried symbolic power. For too long, the rural majority had been left with dust and debt, while foreign corporations grew fat on the nation's soil. Now, the balance tilted back towards those who had carried the weight of survival with calloused hands. Across communities, the reaction was not merely relief, but rebirth. Subsistence farmers spoke of planting with dignity. Women's cooperatives began to plan food processing centers. Youth groups started experimenting with solar-powered drying systems and agro-data management. Marginalized communities, once excluded, now found themselves included in the architecture of the nation's future. Yet, for all the celebration, a question lingered. Redistribution was not a panacea. Land without tools, water, or infrastructure could still be a trap. Traoré understood this and linked land reform with access to cooperatives, irrigation networks, and training. It was not a gift. It was empowerment. And it carried political consequences. By dismantling the privileges of elites and ending the dominance of foreign firms, the government had shifted the balance of power inside Burkina Faso itself. Families who had once hoarded thousands of hectares found their influence waning. Political dynasties and business moguls who had built empires on land speculation suddenly saw the ground pulled from beneath their feet. Supporters called it justice. Critics whispered of betrayal. Either way, the nation was no longer the same. This was not just another headline in the flood of Ibrahim Traore news. It was the recalibration of sovereignty, a reshaping of how power, wealth, and dignity were distributed across society. The law had taken the soil from the hands of a few and returned it to the many. But as the people celebrated, and as elites simmered in discontent, one shadow lingered over the horizon. Yet as land returned to the people, whispers of resistance began to grow, not just abroad, but within. Outside Burkina Faso, the law was met with disbelief, outrage, and quiet calculation. Across African borders, the symbolism was undeniable. Civil society groups in Mali, Senegal, and Ghana began citing Burkina Faso in their policy papers. Youth wings of political parties invoked Traoré's decision as proof that sovereignty was not an abstract dream, but a law that could be written. The African Union and ECOWAS hesitated, torn between principles of solidarity and the pressure of international partners. In Brussels, European Union officials framed the reform as a threat to investment stability. In Washington, analysts warned of a hostile precedent. And in the corridors of Western embassies, whispers of sanctions and suspended aid became louder by the day. Major media outlets portrayed Captain Ibrahim Traoré as a reckless populist, a man gambling with his nation's future. Think tanks released reports predicting famine, isolation, and collapse. Investors scrambled, freezing contracts and pulling out of negotiations. Yet beneath the criticism lay a deeper fear: precedent. If Burkina Faso could erase private land ownership and survive, what would stop Mali, Ghana, or Kenya from following? The fear was not of economic mismanagement. It was of contagion and idea spreading across the continent that Africa's soil could finally be African again. For many in the West, the memory of South Africa's land reform debate was still fresh. In 2024, President Cyril Ramaphosa had pushed for expropriation without compensation, reopening the wounds of apartheid inequality. The backlash was immediate. U.S. President Donald Trump denounced it as a land grab, threatened to cut aid, and accused South Africa of racism. Elon Musk tweeted cryptically about property rights, and headlines warned of collapse. South Africa stumbled in committees and revisions. Burkina Faso acted with finality. That difference was what shook observers. There were no debates, no hearings, no softened compromises. Just one law, signed in silence but echoing loudly across continents. Traoré did not flinch, even as the backlash grew. He called the reform not recklessness but healing, not extremism but restoration. Yet healing comes at a price. As aid packages were suspended and diplomatic ties cooled, rumors began to circulate. Some spoke not just of sanctions, but of threats far darker. There were even whispers of a tentative d'assassinat, Ibrahim Traoré, a reminder that sovereignty is never given freely, it is defended at cost. And so, the question grew heavier. If policies cannot be stopped through pressure, will those who fear them resort to something worse? If they cannot stop him with policy, will they try with pressure or worse? With the soil reclaimed and the law signed, Burkina Faso now stood at a crossroads. The challenge was no longer simply to declare sovereignty, but to build upon it. Could a nation dismissed as poor and landlocked turn land into a foundation for dignity, industry, and growth? Already, signs of change were visible. Instead of exporting raw crops for distant markets, the government prioritized food sovereignty. Fields once dedicated to avocados for Parisian supermarkets or flowers for European auctions were now being redirected towards millet, maize, sorghum, and legumes, the staples that fed Burkinabe families. Hunger was no longer treated as an unavoidable curse, but as a solvable injustice. At the same time, agriculture was being transformed from subsistence to industry. Economic zones were established where land was reserved for Burkinabe entrepreneurs, not foreign giants. Tomato paste factories, grain mills, peanut oil presses, and cassava flour units began to rise, replacing imports and keeping value within the country. In Koudougou, a tomato processing plant was projected to save more than $8 million annually by ending reliance on Italian imports. Each of these steps pointed to the same truth. Sovereignty was not isolationism. It was intentional design, yet the risks were undeniable. Sanctions threatened to choke trade. Suspended aid loomed over budgets. Investors hesitated, fearing to engage with a nation charting its own course. For a landlocked country with fragile infrastructure, the road ahead was steep. But Traoré's government framed the struggle differently. It was not about competing with the world on terms dictated from abroad. It was about surviving on its own terms, planting seeds that could one day feed not only Burkina Faso, but its neighbors. Women and youth stood at the center of this vision. Women's cooperatives were not symbolic gestures, but engines of resilience. Youth programs turned despair into innovation, linking tradition with technology. In their hands, land was no longer a trap, but a launch pad. What mattered was not merely possession of soil, but the dignity it restored, the futures it opened, the sovereignty it declared. And so the horizon remained uncertain. Would Burkina Faso endure the weight of international pressure, or would its example ignite a continental shift too powerful to suppress? The question was no longer whether one nation could reclaim its soil. It was whether that act could spread, whether Africa itself could rewrite its destiny from the ground beneath its feet. The harvest has only just begun. Burkina Faso's decision to erase private land ownership was not a mere policy adjustment. It was a declaration, a rupture with centuries of dispossession, a line drawn in the soil. For too long, Africa's land had been sold as real estate, traded as a commodity, and stripped of its sacred meaning. With one stroke of a pen, Captain Ibrahim Traoré reminded the world that land is not a product. It is life, memory, and sovereignty. What unfolded in Ouagadougou was not simply Ibrahim Traoré news, it was Africa's news. It was a reminder that sovereignty is not begged for, but claimed. That dignity is not a slogan, but a law. And that freedom is not abstract, but rooted in the very ground people walk upon. For the farmers who now cultivate fields without fear, for the women whose cooperatives now hold secure plots, for the youth who see opportunity instead of exile, this law was not charity. It was restoration. It was the soil finally answering their labor with recognition. Yet challenges remain. International pressure is mounting. Sanctions are whispered. Investors hesitate, and rumors of tentative assassinat Ibrahim Traoré cast a shadow, reminding us that sovereignty has always been dangerous when it dares to succeed. But even in that danger lies a truth too powerful to silence. An idea once planted cannot easily be uprooted. This is not just about one country. It is about a continent reclaiming its right to decide. It is about a generation refusing to wait for permission. It is about Africa saying no to dependency and yes to dignity. The world may not be ready, but Africa is rising. The soil is speaking. And the question remains, if land can heal a nation, can it ignite a continent? If Burkina Faso can reclaim its ground, what stops the rest? This is not the end of a story. This is the beginning of a harvest. And to those watching from near and far, the call is simple. Do not let this story remain in silence. Share it, speak it, carry it. Because this is not just Ibrahim Traoré news. It is the news of a continent learning once more to stand tall. Burkina Faso's decision to erase private land ownership was not a mere policy adjustment. It was a declaration, a rupture with centuries of dispossession, a line drawn in the soil. For too long, Africa's land had been sold as real estate, traded as a commodity, and stripped of its sacred meaning. With one stroke of a pen, Captain Ibrahim Traoré reminded the world that land is not a product. It is life, memory, and sovereignty. What unfolded in Ouagadougou was not simply Ibrahim Traoré news, it was Africa's news. It was a reminder that sovereignty is not begged for, but claimed. That dignity is not a slogan, but a law. And that freedom is not abstract, but rooted in the very ground people walk upon. For the farmers who now cultivate fields without fear, for the women whose cooperatives now hold secure plots, for the youth who see opportunity instead of exile, this law was not charity. It was restoration. It was the soil finally answering their labor with recognition. Yet challenges remain. International pressure is mounting. Sanctions are whispered. Investors hesitate. And rumors of tentative d'assassinat, Ibrahim Traore, cast a shadow, reminding us that sovereignty has always been dangerous when it dares to succeed. But even in that danger lies a truth too powerful to silence. An idea once planted cannot easily be uprooted. This is not just about one country. It is about a continent reclaiming its right to decide. It is about a generation refusing to wait for permission. It is about Africa saying no to dependency and yes to dignity. The world may not be ready, but Africa is rising. The soil is speaking. And the question remains, if land can heal a nation, can it ignite a continent? If Burkina Faso can reclaim its ground, what stops the rest? This is not the end of a story. This is the beginning of a harvest. And to those watching from near and far, the call is simple. Do not let this story remain in silence. Share it, speak it, carry it. Because this is not just Ibrahim Traore news. It is the news of a continent learning once more to stand tall.